Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I am your host, Alan Moore, and I am so thankful that you have joined me today. I honestly think that today is my favorite episode so far. I'm being serious. Today's show is an interview with Carl Richards, also known as The Behavior Gap. Now, Carl has written several books, New York Times bestsellers, has a weekly column in the New York Times, speaks all over the world, and yet back at our conference, XYPN 15, back in September, his presentation was about his fear of failure. His fear that he wasn't good enough, that no one gave him permission to be a New York Times writer. And he determined that this fear had a name, and it's called the imposter syndrome. I remember feeling like someone had punched me in the gut when he was talking about it, because it's something I personally feel all the time, and something I bet a lot of listeners have felt at one time or another, and yet didn't really know what it was. So in this episode, we talk about the different types or versions of the imposter syndrome and how to recognize it. And then we close out with a discussion on what you can actually do about it. And I will go ahead and give you a hint that it does not include trying to make the feeling go away. Now, as always, you can access the show notes and additional resources mentioned in this show at xyplanningnetwork.com/40. And be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. So without any further delay, here's my interview with Carl Richards. Hey, Carl, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for being on.
Excited to talk to you again.
It has been a little while. It's been back episode 2, I believe, was the last time we had you on. So you were one of, I think you and Michael with episode 1 are jockeying for most downloads ever for an episode of XYPN Radio. So,
well, listen, my wife tells me that I'm competitive, and I don't believe her, but it really bugs me that I wasn't episode number 1, and I better have the most downloads. I'm just kidding. Why do we have to turn everything into a race? Always
everything
a race.
Everything has to be a race. So go to xyplanningnetwork.com/2, download Carl's original episode so you can help him beat Michael.
Yes, for sure. But not because I'm competitive.
Not at all. Not because we want to win. It's simply because we want the most downloads.
She's a yoga instructor. My wife is, and sometimes I'll go to yoga and I'll tell her, like, before her class starts, she's the teacher and there's 20 other people. I'll lean over and whisper to her, like, I think I can beat everybody here. And she's like, what? You've totally missed the whole point. I'm like, I know. I'm just teasing.
I know. I love that. You're the type of person that likes to win at yoga. Of course I am. That's why I don't do yoga, because I know I can't win.
That's exactly right. It's so funny.
It was actually one of the hard things about getting into CrossFit was that when I looked around the gym, I realized I was never going to win because there's just too many athletes. Yeah. And that was a hard thing to stomach for me.
For sure. No, I got destroyed at CrossFit all the time. It was really good for me.
So for anyone out there who hasn't tried CrossFit, I joined the cult. Are you still in the cult of CrossFit and still doing it regularly?
After 2 torn labrums in my shoulders, I am officially done with CrossFit.
But I'm certain that wasn't CrossFit's fault as an advocate for it.
But let me just, now that we've said it, I went to the doctor, and we have great orthopedic surgeons in Park City, as you can imagine. And the doctor looked at me. I was holding my shoulder, and the doctor looked at me and goes, let me guess, you're 40 years old and you were at CrossFit. He knew exactly. So I guess, it's not CrossFit's fault. We have an amazing gym here and amazing instructors here, but there is, you got to make sure you know what you're doing. It's
very true. You got to be careful, but sorry, all the CrossFit advocates out there.
Yes.
So one of the things since our last episode, and again, for listeners that didn't listen to it, go check it out, xyplanningnetwork.com/2. We went through kind of your financial planning process that you basically implemented whenever you had your financial planning firm. And one of the questions, and I think you kind of hinted at it, and then at our conference at XYPN 15 back in September, you gave a keynote presentation where you mentioned, didn't really focus on it, but you kind of touched on a concept called the imposter syndrome. And it is something that has honestly come up in multiple episodes. It's come up in a lot of conversation, as well as our VIP community, that what is this thing called imposter syndrome? We've heard, anybody that was at at the conference and heard you speak has said it before. So we just wanted to kind of have a conversation about this thing that we've named, which we can talk about, but I think that's actually a big first step. And then just kind of see where it goes from there. So first off, when did you first come across this concept that you've labeled the imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and let me just be clear about a couple of things. So I certainly was not the one to label it.
Oh, fair enough.
And also another thing I want to just mention, that because I've done a bunch of research on it and read probably everything that's ever been written on this thing. And I still like the term imposter syndrome simply because it's catchy, but I want to be clear that, for those of you who know what a syndrome is, that's probably not the right label, right? Like we may be talking about imposterism or imposter feelings, but we're still going to use imposter syndrome here. I realize that may be stretching a little bit. And so for those of you who care about such things, please forgive me. I've already received those emails. You don't need to send them. So it's like the Venn diagram emails I get. Like, no, they're not Venn diagrams. They're just circle sketches. Leave me alone. So let's just call it imposter syndrome. Let's just agree. But here's the deal with imposter syndrome. Super fascinating. It's this feeling, like the kind of technical definition is when you have a hard time internalizing your own success despite external evidence to the contrary. Like you feel like a failure despite external evidence to the contrary. And what's interesting is the more evidence you get, and this is a broad-based experience, like we don't have super clear data about it, but some of the research that's been done is like 70% of people that are high achievement folks feel this way. So it's
70%. That's insane.
This is just an anecdote. I can't verify it, but I heard, and I've heard this from two different places now, that, and I'm not going to mention the name, but one of the top like 3 business schools in the country, MBA schools in the country, certainly in the top 3 almost every year. There's a story that at one point they did a survey of their incoming MBA class. And one of the questions they snuck in there was, true or false, you feel like you're the only mistake the admissions committee made.
Whoa.
And 72% checked true.
Wow.
Right? So, and the only reason this is important is I think it's really important to understand, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but really important to understand, like, you are not alone if you feel this way. And the way it shows up, the way this feeling shows up, this is like, so far we haven't really described it. The way it sort of shows up is you're going to do something it really is prominent when you're doing something new and novel. Right? So anytime you're doing something new and novel, and that could be that it's new and novel to you, like you've never done it before. And in that case, right, like you are an imposter, right? Like you're just learning, like you just wrote your first book. Like I look back on my sort of first early writing. I'm actually far more proud of my first book than the second one, but some of the early writing I look back at and go, gosh, I can't believe I do that. I'm redoing some of the sketches because I just don't like the way the early ones sort of look. And so I was indeed sort of, that's like the fake it till you make it mode, right? We're referring to that sort of phase of imposterism as the newbie, right? So when you're doing anything that's new and novel, you sort of have this feeling in your stomach like, wait, am I allowed to do this? That's how it always showed up for me. Like, wait, do I have to have a license? Like, who gave me permission?
Did you have that feeling when you were doing some of those early sketches?
I have that feeling now with the sketches, like every Thursday. So tomorrow when I sit down to do, it's the deadline for the New York Times image. When I sit down to do it and I'm in my office now, I always end up, I don't know when this started or why, but I always ended up looking over my left-hand shoulder because my door is over my left shoulder. And I have this vision, and I've actually had this dream. Now, this is like a different type of counseling, and I'm not expecting you to help me with it, Alan, but I've actually had this dream where a guy, and I now know who it is, a guy shows up at my door, and my doors are glass, so I can see right through my doors. A guy is standing outside my door, and he's in a suit, and I figured out who it is. It's Homer Simpson's boss. Is that like Mr. Smithers? Is that his name? But he's dressed like that. He's got a suit on. He looks like a really mean IRS agent. And he opens the door, and I've had 2 versions of this dream. In one version of the dream, he opens the door and he points at me and he says, "Hey, whoa, what's going on here? Don't you know you're in Park City, Utah? You're a kid from the hills, right? You've got a Sharpie in your hand, and that's cardstock, and you think that's going to go in the New York Times? I'm sorry, you're done. You're a fraud. You're out," right? Like, that's one version. The other version is he comes in, and this is the dream I had. There's this huge light switch, like a 2-foot big, in my dream, light switch, and above it says Carl Richards' career. and it's on, right? Like this light switch is flipped to on. He looks over at me with this really evil grin and grabs the light switch and flips it to off. It's like, so every Thursday, I still feel a little piece of that. Like, well, what are you doing? Like, really? You're going to send this thing? And so that may be a dramatic example of how the imposter syndrome shows up, but a more subtle one would be that first time you show up at a meeting with maybe a group of clients, maybe there's 2 or 3, or maybe you're going to give your first like small group presentation. There's going to be 10 people in the room and they're all surgeons. And you sort of walk in and you have the feeling of like, oh my gosh, they're all looking at me. You're looking around the room for the adult and you find out it's you. That's a feeling. And the imposter syndrome, like when it's new and novel, to some degree, you are kind of fake it till you make it, right?
Of course. That's how that's the beauty of being an entrepreneur. I think that's our life.
Yeah. So we're calling that archetype. We've developed so far 3, but we're thinking there may be 3 to 5 archetypes of how the imposter shows up. And when you're the newbie, sort of like you just have to realize that's part of the deal, right? Like whenever you're new at anything, you've sort of gotta approach it with beginner's mind, and you've got to accept the reality that you may not be particularly awesome at this yet, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. Everybody who ever got awesome at the thing you're trying to do started out really bad.
That's it.
Right? So that's one way it shows up.
I want to make a note to listeners, because I have a lot of respect for you for being able to have the conversation about this, because I understand that there are probably some listeners out there. I probably had this feeling the first time I heard you talk about it, of almost this like false modesty feeling of like, I'm so successful. Here's what somebody may hear. I'm so successful. I write, a weekly column in the New York Times, and I feel so great that I need to bring myself down a notch. And I want to emphasize that is so not what's happening here.
Yeah, I gotta tell you what just happened. Like I could feel in my gut, like I wanted to punch you in the face. Yeah, I don't mean that really, but like that's totally true. Like I'm not. That's really interesting, actually. I'd never even thought of that. When I used to talk about this, I used to start the talk I would give was called The Accidental Artist. And I would start by telling these series of stories about all these amazing things that had happened. And then I used to start it with a picture of a kid. Like imagine like a 7-year-old, I'm going to use boy because I'm a boy. Like imagine a 7-year-old boy going off a jump on his bike for the first time. And the jump was like a milk crate, a piece of wood on a milk crate. So it's like a foot off the ground, right? It's not a big deal. Goes off the jump the first time and comes skidding into a stop in front of his parents and just says, "Did you see that?" That's the spirit in which I tell these stories. Is not like, it's just sort of like, can you believe what's happened?
Yeah.
And this is so fun. And then people are like, well, how did it happen? So the whole reason I'm even talking about this, to be honest, is about 4 years ago, a really good friend of mine was like, hey, you really need to write this story. And I remember saying to him, and I've had this conversation, there's probably been 20 people that have tried to pin me down on this. And I was like, there's nothing to write. And they said, what do you mean? Like, what would you tell your daughter about things you've learned from your career? And I was like, dude, there's nothing. Like, none of what's happened to me is repeatable. It's all completely, totally random luck. And my friend was like, I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. And I was like, no, really? Like, how do you possibly come up with a repeatable principle for success, or whatever you'd call it, like the 3 principles of success, like whatever the name of that book would be? How do you possibly come up with those on this story? Like I was at the right time at the right place. Things happened. And so he's kept pushing me to develop a couple of ideas around this, like play in traffic and hope to get hit. And then he was like, but okay, how were you able to play in traffic and other people weren't? And so we kept pushing until we got to this point of like, it was sort of just like, can you do work and then say to the world, like Seth Godin loves to say this, hey, I made this thing. I hope you like it. And then we got to this thing like, okay, what's the thing that stops other people? And then I'll be quiet and actually answer your questions. But I had this experience and I'd heard about this. I can't remember who wrote about it the first time, but I actually had this experience where I got asked to go talk about art. All the school in Park City, there's only 5 schools. And I happened to have a kid in each one of the schools, right? In the elementary school, I had a first grader. And I had this experience where I went and I said to the first grade class, how many of you are artists? Right? And you've all heard this story because somebody else wrote about it. As you can imagine, in the first grade class, every hand went up, like enthusiastically, just like boom, right? And then I went to my son's fifth grade class and I said, how many of you are artists? And like 50% of the hands went up, and a couple of them went up and then saw like their buddy's hand wasn't up. And so it sort of sheepishly came down. And then I went to my 16-year-old daughter. She was a junior at the time. She was in the high school art class. It's an elective. Like you had to sign up for it, right? And I go in there and there's 17 kids in the high school art class, and two hands go up and they look around and they see nobody else and they pull them back down. And we had an hour and there was only 17 people there. So I was like, what was that? Right. And that was the sort of the narrative that got me to this point where I was like, okay, what is it about certain people that will create something that they're quote unquote not allowed to create? The world has told them they're not allowed to, and they're going to do it anyway. And they're going to say to the world, hey, I hope you like this thing. And often the world's going to say, that's a garbage. Like, who do you think you are for doing that? The world's going to say mean and nasty things, and they're going to do it again. And they're going to do it again. And they're going to do it again. And so that's the spirit in which I tell these stories, is not like, look at what I've accomplished. It's like, gosh, can we figure out from my story and millions of other stories, what is it about? How can we keep doing? Because here's the deal, and this is the reason why I care about it with advisors. Like doing, as I've traveled around the world, if I had to use one word to describe how the public feels about money right now, it would be anxiety or anxious. And then I have conversations with you and all the real financial advisors I know. They have the medicine for that disease. And the dilemma is, and the only reason they have it is because they're doing something different. Like we're finally doing it different than the traditional financial services industry has always done it, because the traditional financial services industry has only led to anxiety, and you're doing it different. And I just keep seeing people who want to do it different and aren't because they're scared and nervous. And so I think the imposter, if I can help people solve that, to do it anyway, like the work that real financial advisors are doing is new and novel. Like by definition, it's new and novel.
Absolutely.
Almost nobody's seen it before. So that's, sorry to take it full circle, but that's why I care about this.
I think it's really important because as somebody who personally struggles with this, it was huge for me to see someone who, like yourself, who I would consider very successful dealing with this. And I'm sure that you have people in your life that you would deem very successful that you've heard, make comments or say things. And I think it can be an issue. Like anything, you can learn how to manage it. I think you can learn how to overcome things. But I think the negative side of it shows up in a couple of different ways. And, add to this if you see any other areas. One is, if it strikes so much fear in you that you ultimately can't take the step forward. If you're staring at your first blog post and you're looking at it going, I really want to publish this, but who am I to put this information out there? There's so many better writers. They could just go read the New York Times. They could go read, Jeff Rose's blog. They could go read the Behavior Gap blog and get this information. Why me? And they never hit publish. They never launch a company. They never try anything new because we're so paralyzed by the fear of what if somebody finds out that, and we can talk more about, kind of how it manifests itself. But I think that's the negative side. And I think the other piece too is for those that have found a way to overcome it. It's still this like lingering feeling in your stomach. At least this is how I experience it, of always being on edge, almost like it's almost always being Chicken Little. The sky is falling. Anytime something negative happens, it's like, oh no, it's not working. We have to scrap it and try something new instead of being able to ride through that feeling. You lose 3 clients in a week and suddenly you're like, okay, I got to shut down the firm without thinking about the fact you have 40 other clients.
Yeah, for sure.
And I personally anytime we lose a couple members in XYPN, we're like, I'm ready to throw in the towel and like, it's not working. And fortunately I have Michael Kitsis there to go, maybe you should look again, which is really helpful for me. But that's why we're talking about this, is because we want to be sure that whenever you have that feeling that you can recognize it and talk about it and move past it, because ultimately, to your point, everyone is an artist and everyone can be an artist if they want to be. And if you want to take that step forward and you want to try something new, try something other people haven't seen before, that's okay. We want you to do that. And it's just about overcoming that feeling.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff in there that's really important. So I think if you understand, so like this is making me really happy because a lot of the research we're doing on naming sort of the archetypes of how imposter syndrome shows up in people's lives is exactly in what you just described. So we've talked a little bit about the newbie, we're going to call them, and you're doing something for the first time. And the newbie experience can show up, throughout your life. It's not like, oh, I'm going to give my first talk to a big group, or I'm going to give it shows up. I mean, I've given talks to 5,000 people, and I'll still go to like a group of like a new group, like the Utah Bar Association asked me to come speak, and I was like, oh, what, attorneys? What do I have to say, right? And the feeling showed up there too. So anytime something's new and novel, which is like almost all the time, it shows up, and it's sort of, that's like, you just kind of got to do it and realize that, you got to keep doing it. But the second one I really think is important that you just hint on, and we call it the guilty survivor. I'm not sure the name's right yet, but it's as you get more successful, there's this really interesting thing, right? You're doing new work. It's kind of crappy. You think it's great, but you're going to realize 10 years later that it's not, but you're going to do it anyway, right? Like, don't let that worry you. You do it, and then it starts to get a little better, and then people start to accept it. And you start to get a little positive feedback instead of all the negative feedback. You get some positive feedback, and you've maybe priced it in the world, like whatever you're charging for whatever you're doing, you may have priced it pretty low, and you feel good about this relationship because you're doing good work and you're delivering a lot of value, and you've underpriced it, and you feel good about this relationship. And then one day you're like, hey, I've underpriced this, and you move the price up for whatever it is. Like, it could be a book, it could be writing, it could be charging money for the first time, it could be your financial planning practice, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't really matter that it's dollars either. I'm just saying that the exchange, for some reason, you decide to move the value of what you're doing up a little bit. Right then, when you do that, which is what I think of as the guilty survivor, is I think of it as you start to blow a balloon underneath yourself. Like, there's air beneath you, like the fall will be much, much further down, right? Like, if you're charging $1,000 to give a talk to somebody, that's one thing. If you're charging $25,000 to give a talk to somebody, that's an entirely different. Actually, it's not, but it
feels like it.
Yeah, the experience starts. It's a new experience now. Like, you may have given the same talk to the same group, but now since you're charging more, it's that feeling showing up in a different way. And you just talked about it, like if 3 members leave, or if 1 client leaves, but you're already successful. So it's a different feeling. We think of it as the guilty survivor, and it's true, the research shows this, like high achievers feel feelings of being an imposter just as much, maybe even more, than people who haven't had any achievement yet. And the reason is because the fear of the fall, like being found out. Like Maya Angelou, I mean, I've heard this, we've gathered all sorts of quotes, but some fascinating ones. Like Maya Angelou was like, every day, like she was the, whatever that's called, the poet laureate, like amazing, right? She's been to the White House. And she said, like, when she finishes a poem, she often expects, she used the same metaphor, she often expects a guy to bust through the door and go, hey, you're a fraud, and today's the day everybody's going to find out. And so I just think it's really helpful from the perspective. The reason why I like having this conversation is what helped me the most was when somebody named it. And I remember who I was talking to, the phone call, everything. And they said, that has a name. And I was like, what? And said, it's called the imposter syndrome. And I was like, what? Really? And then I went and looked in the research, it does have a name. And now what we're trying to do with the work I'm doing on the sort of new project, which will take the form of a book at some point, is to help people understand even more carefully how it shows up. Not necessarily what to do about it, because that's a whole different subject, which we can talk about, but at least knowing how it shows up and stories from people's lives. I find it really, for me, it's really helpful to know that Maya Angelou had that feeling. And if she had that feeling, it makes it okay for me to have that feeling.
And it's kind of funny whenever we actually have this conversation, I think, and hear from people like that they struggle with this, because from the outside, successful people just seem so confident. They seem so successful. I remember my major professor, it was actually very recently, it was in the last year, that he told me that when I graduated college, I guess when I went through college afterwards, he has always said that he had 2 students that had more confidence than ability, and it just took them a few years to get their ability up, and I was one of them. and I laugh at that, because anybody that knows me probably would recognize that side, and yet I didn't feel very confident coming out of school, getting that first job, being completely lost. And And, I by no means want to put myself on the pedestal in terms of success, but I know that there are some people out there that look at, me having started a business and they see that as success and they want to replicate that. There are people that I'm looking to as successful, and we just don't hear them talk about it, I don't think. And I think it's just so important to recognize that, anecdotally, 70% of people that we would deem successful don't necessarily view themselves as successful, or they have this fear that a mistake was made or a mistake is going to be made. My understanding is actors, actresses, songwriters deal with this quite a bit. And that rise to fame, sometimes quick rises to fame, can cause these issues.
Yeah, there's also an element of sort of creative work. And look, I hope nobody finds a place to hide behind, if I use the term creative work, because everybody listening to this is doing creative work. So I'm using that term pretty broadly, but there is an element of, because it tends to be new and novel. And then there's another element that's really important when other people have expectations of you. Right? There's one thing to be scared, like an internal fear of doing the work, and that's what Stephen Pressfield named the resistance, right? Like, and Seth Godin talks about it as the lizard brain, and the resistance in Stephen Pressfield's book, The War of Art, which is all about the resistance. That's one thing, and it's, I think, a close cousin to imposter syndrome. But I think there's another thing that shows up when people start to have expectations of you, and those expectations could be, you just put the CFP letters on your card, and now people expect you, but you don't know what you're doing. Like, what? How do I know? I just started. Like, I'm a student, like whatever. Those feelings are normal, right? So I'm thinking of the neurosurgeon who is sitting down, staring with the family, staring in the eyes of the parents as he's about to go operate on the brain of their child, right? And those expectations. And that was our third archetype, actually. We called him the self-aware expert. And we were thinking of, specifically, we were thinking of surgeons and really high quality financial planners and attorneys. And the hallmark of the self-aware expert is typically the expectations placed on you by others. And, whether they have realistic expectations or not, there is that element of it where it's like, wow, a lot of those people, it's like same thing with the creatives. Like, we'll say like, oh, and this is one other element, Alan, that's important for people to understand, really important, because when you focus on something like giving great financial advice, like, let me give you a situation. Like, so maybe 5 or 6 years ago, actually it's probably more like 10 years ago, I'd been in the industry giving sort of financial planning advice for 10 years. And I think we could all probably admit that after you've gone through this a couple hundred times with people, it doesn't take you long. Like, in the first half hour, I sort of feel like I already know exactly what we're going to do. And I've had this conversation with lots of my doctor buddies. Like, often they're like, I've made a diagnosis in 3 minutes. And 99% of the time I'm right after I've built a body of work, right? Body of experience. And that in and of itself leads to its own, like, wait, these guys are going to pay me a bunch of money, and it only took me, 15 minutes to sort of get to the bottom of their problem. And we start, because that has gotten easier for us. And I don't mean easy, I just mean easier, right? It
becomes faster.
Yeah, it's faster. It may even be like, to use a different sort of analogy too, it may even be something you're naturally good at. Like, let's say you're a great speaker or a great writer. And because so for whatever reason, whether it was hard-earned sort of experience in work, or it just came natural, or it came natural and you added some work on it, for whatever reason, you've gotten really good at something. What happens when you get really good at something is it tends to be a little easier. You're really good at it. It's natural. I can do it, right? It comes naturally. We'll use words like that. When we start to use words like that, we start to think everybody else, because it's natural for me, it must be natural for everyone.
Exactly.
Therefore, it must be easy. And since it's easy, it's not valuable.
And that's when you start lowering your prices or giving discounts or waiving fees, because you suddenly aren't valuable. And we want to provide value, right? I mean, I think that's kind of a natural instinct, that we want to provide value for the price that we're charging.
Or instead of lowering your fees or doing any of that, you also may continue to charge the same thing, but you go home feeling terribly like a fraud. Like, this is so easy. How come my son's 4th grade teacher makes X and I make 4X and I don't work as hard? Like you get all in these market comparisons, and then you get into this weird, again, when you're doing new and novel work, there's another element of this that's hard when there's no comp, right? Like we, particularly all of us financial professionals, we're really good at saying, all right, this thing that they claim will yield, give me like that guy down the street that's saying, I have this investment that's just like a CD and it yields 4%. Well, we're really good at knowing, like, okay, 4%, let's go out into the market. What else yields 4%? Okay, it's not a CD, right? Like we know just like a CD is not the same as a CD. And if it yields 4%, I'm telling you right now, it's not a CD. So we're really good at finding comps, right? Like, but in our own work, particularly in this age right now where a lot of the people listening to this are having to make new pricing decisions. Like you're changing the model. Like who gave you permission to do that? That's not allowed. And now you go out and look, but nobody else has done this. How do I comp my work? Oh, what does an accountant charge per hour? Oh, what is all of that stuff leads to these feelings. And I guess the takeaway for me, like at least my goal would be for everybody to know, like that's totally normal. And the second thing to know is it probably won't go away. That feeling probably won't go away. In fact, if you're expecting success to make it go away, we've already demonstrated you probably might even feel it stronger as you get more successful because you'll feel like there's this giant air bubble underneath you that if that thing ever pops, it's going to hurt a lot, right?
Yeah, and I wonder how many people out there deny themselves success in order to avoid the risk of that happening.
Yeah. That's my whole. I just had this conversation with Seth Godin last week about that. Like he was like, well, why are you doing this? That's the whole point right there. The whole point is to get my 17-year-old daughter to raise her hand when she's asked if she's an artist, and to get the 35-year-old financial planner who's just had enough and wants to do it differently. So I think of it this way. And I'm drawing right now as we're talking with my hands, I can't help it. I think there's three components. So number one, I think of it as a thing that you want to do, right? So you've got this thing, and I'm using thing instead of art because I don't want you to feel pressure or hide, or work or financial planning. Like you just insert whatever it is this thing that you want to do. Maybe you want to write a novel. Maybe you want to start your new financial planning practice, whatever it is. It's this thing. So you have a thing. So there's three requirements. You have a thing you want to do. You have some baseline ability to do it, right? Like we got to be careful here. If you're 5'2" and you want to make it to the NBA, like you're feeling the imposter syndrome feelings for a reason. It's not going to work.
Must be Bo would disagree, but he's the only one.
I guess that's true. But I've got buddies that have been trying to make the PGA Tour for 10 years, right?
Sure.
At great cost to their families and their personal lives. And my wife, I love my wife. I think she's an amazing singer. She'll never be a great soloist, no matter how many classes and she doesn't even want to be. But that doesn't mean she can't. My buddy who's trying to make the PGA Tour can't play amateur tours. It's just don't put your family and everything else on the line for this following your passion thing. There's a fine line here that we're still working out how to describe exactly. But here's the way I describe it. You've got a thing you want to do. You've got some baseline ability to do it. Right? You've got some external evidence that you could pull this off. And it may only be your own, right? But whatever. And the third, the ability to do it, and the world's telling you that you can. I think of it as sort of tailwind. So if you've got that stuff going on, what's going to happen when you go to take the first step is you're going to bump up against this wall, right? And I'm naming that wall. That wall has been named the imposter syndrome. And what we're trying to do is exactly what you said, which just kills me to think of somebody sitting in, and I had an experience at XYPN, the conference. I had two people come up to me in tears saying, Carl, I've got this thing and I know it's awesome, but I just can't do it. And that's what we're trying. Like, why can't you do it? Well, because I just can't show it to the world. Right. And I've talked with both those people since, and they've done it and they've shown it to the world, and they're getting a little feedback and they're making it better and they're showing it to the world, and they took little steps, and that's what we want. Right. So when you bump up against that wall, know that A, it's got a name. B, you're among a very great group of 70% of the world that feels that way. And it's a good sign that you're feeling that way. And also C, know that it's probably not going to go away. The goal is not to get it to go away. The goal is not to get it to go away.
So are there any other archetypes that you're defining beyond the three that you've mentioned?
No. So right now, I'm not sure we've gotten them all. We're having I've got like a group of really creative people involved in this project, and we have our next meeting on Thursday. Yeah, tomorrow tomorrow. So I don't know, but we've named them the newbie, which is sort of like, and we did that because we want people to realize like you're feeling this way for a reason and it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the guy in the middle? The guilty survivor. And we think that's heavily related to doing creative work that doesn't have a comparable in the market, right? Like it's new and novel. And among the guilty survivor, there often is some element of luck, right? Like that you just can't deny.
Of course.
Like, I don't know why I have an amazing book agent and somebody else doesn't, right? Like, and was my book that much better than somebody? I don't know. I just know that I don't know why Ron Lieber happened to run across my blog one day and say, hey, I really like this versus somebody else. I don't know why, but so I'm a guilty survivor, right? I do know I can say, okay, well, that's awesome. Let's make the most of it. And then the third one is that self-aware expert.
So you said just a minute ago that the goal is not to get it to go away, which makes me cringe because I'm somebody who does not live in pain very well. If I'm in pain, I tend to do something to fix that pain. And so the push is always to cure it, right? Make it go away. Yep. So if it's not to make it go away and you're saying we can't make it go away unless we make ourselves basically not successful, what do you do? What's the goal then that we do with this thing that we're calling the imposter syndrome?
Yeah. I love that. And I kept hanging that out there hoping you would ask because, right, like it sounds so silly. The goal is not to get it to go away, but that's absolutely true. The goal is not to get it to go away. The goal is to become an alchemist, right? To turn that feeling. That feeling can either do two things to you. One is you run away in fear, or two, you turn it into fuel. And it's the same feeling. Like you can either run away in fear, which is what most of us do. You absolutely can get it to go away. Stop doing anything that is new and novel. Yeah, that's new and novel. Just stop. That's one way. The second way would be an alchemist. And the goal, actually, there's only one goal, and that's to do it anyway. And so I kept hoping that feeling would go away. And something changed about a year ago when I said, I don't even know if it was a year ago or more like 2, but anyway, a while ago, when I finally was like, oh, hey, my friend, right? Like I took that approach one day. I was like, hey, you're back. And maybe it had been a time like where it had been 2 or 3 weeks or something, and I hadn't felt that feeling. Or so I can't remember exactly where it was, but I just remember saying, oh, hey, I remember you. Like you always show up when I'm about to do something really cool. I'm so glad you're back. This is awesome. Let's get to work, brother.
I love that positive view because basically what you're saying is when I do something awesome, when I do something successful, I get that feeling. So when I get that feeling, it must mean I'm on the cusp of doing something awesome and hopefully we'll be successful.
Yeah. And like there is a flip side to that, which is also like I'm about to do something that also may not work. And like that's cool too. Like, and I know that all sounds so, but here's Elizabeth Gilbert. I mean, I had started sort of this sense of like, well, here, there's two things. One, I started to realize I had that feeling on the start line of big mountain bike races that I may not finish, like long mountain bike race that I may not finish. I had also had that feeling at the beginning of climbing the Grand Teton almost every time. I'm like, we may not make it. Right, and I don't mean make it like live. I just mean make it to the top. We may not make it. And rock climbing, that feeling of like this is a climb that's just a teeny bit over my head, and I'm going to do it. Like I started to realize, like, whoa, it feels the same. Going on stage for the first time with 800 people or like 2,200 people in South Africa. I remember that one specifically because it was really, really heavy for me. I walked out before the event, nobody in the seats yet. And I came from backstage, so I didn't get a chance to see the room. I came from backstage and walked out and was like, boom, 2,500 seats.
Whoa.
Like, and empty, like, but just like, whoa. And I'd never, like, I think the biggest audience before that maybe was 500. But I remember thinking, not that 500 is small, I'm just saying it's a big difference. And I remember thinking, wow, that's so odd, man. That feeling is the same feeling as the mountain bike race. And so then I thought, wait, if this feeling shows up when I'm about to do things that are cool, they're not going to kill me. And then, so that's when I changed that. And then I heard Elizabeth Gilbert talk about it recently. And I don't know if she wrote about it in Big Magic, but I know she's been talking a lot about it lately. And she talks about, it's a little different feeling. She talks about fear. And she says, we all have this motto. I've even seen bumper stickers that are like, kick fear in the teeth. And she's like, wait a second. Fear's my friend. Like that fear has saved my life. Like that time I didn't get in the car when I was 16 with my 4 friends who had been drinking, or the time I didn't cross the street in front of that semi, or the time that I did. Like, fear has saved my life. And so she likes to say, like, fear can always have a place in the back seat of the car. It just can't drive. And she also likes to talk to it too. She'll say, like, hey, I think you're great and you've saved my life and I really appreciate you. But right now, I'm just writing an email. It's going to be okay. Stand down. Would you get back up when I'm about to leave to go out into the world? Right. So I think it's much healthier. So that's the way in Impostor, I'm like, hey, gosh, welcome back, my friend. And I'm glad you're here. So to me, the goal is not to get it to go away. In fact, the goal is the opposite. I'm trying to strip away things in my life that protect me from it. Like, I'm purposely trying to have that feeling. Like, if I go a day or two without it, I'm like, hey, I got to create something. I got to do something. What can I do? Right. And it's not an addiction to like risky behavior. I mean, although it might be, but it's, it's just it's a sense of like, I want to create something new and novel. And by definition, that means some people won't like it.
And I think the creating is what drives you. And I think it's what drives entrepreneurs. I mean, I remember you opened my eyes in a conversation one time when you defined entrepreneurship as an expression of creativity as opposed to just starting a business. Because if you had ever asked me, are you a creative person? I would have said no, because I don't do art. I don't sing. I don't paint. I don't, do anything like that. And yet, when you start to recognize things like starting a business or trying a monthly subscription model instead of just charging assets under management because we want to work with a new type of client, that is an expression of creativity. And it is trying something new, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it.
Look, I'm becoming a fanatic about entrepreneurship, mainly because, and about redefining it, mainly because what I think it means is the business is simply an art project, right? The business, stated even more like my favorite way to say it is, the business is simply the template for forcibly inserting your opinion into the world. Right. So like my daughter, who's a freshman at the University of Utah has an amazing, really good entrepreneurship program. And she wants to study sustainability, mainly sort of water issues, sustainable living, all of that stuff. She's way into that. And so she was going to get a degree in something. I don't know what it was, but it was going to be in like environmental science in the social sciences department, not the physical sciences department. And she decided, I was like, well, okay. I said, you should go to the business school. And she's like, Dad, blah, 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 accounting, blah, 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 shareholder value, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, what if instead I said, starting your own consulting firm to help people to forcibly insert your opinion into the world, that businesses should be more sustainable. And where are you going to have a bigger impact, right? And I just I had lunch with a guy yesterday who wants to start, he's an artist. And I was like, well, okay, what if I was like, you should go to the business school. And he's like, business, blah, 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 accounting, blah, 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 shareholder value. And I was like, no. Yes, you're going to have to sit through those classes. And yes, I think of them as the monkeys. I'm like, you're just going to have to listen to the monkeys. You're going to have to occasionally feed the monkeys. Don't make fun of the monkeys. And don't tell them they're monkeys. Don't do any of that. But just the whole time they're talking, be thinking, forcibly insert your opinion into the world. And so I can't think of nobody who's doing like real financial advisors, financial planners, whatever we call ourselves. That's exactly what we're doing, is saying, I'm going to forcibly insert my opinion in the world. So the business is an art project. It's just a performance art project. And if you do it correctly, right, nobody will remember. If you do what you're trying to do, Alan, if you do it correctly and you're successful, nobody will remember a time when it was different. That's amazing, right? Like that's like, talk about something to be excited about, right? Like that's cool.
I mean, if we want to kind of relate this back in the financial planning world, I mean, none of us remember a time where being fee only was unheard of, and yet the community of fee only advisors just a couple decades ago made this a reality and made it the norm. Now that charging assets under management is just how it's always been. And who knows, maybe monthly subscriptions in another decade will be this is just how we've always charged, right? And we're going to have to go back to the history books to remember a time where that wasn't just the way it was.
I was in the industry when the sort of first steps towards assets under management started. Like I was one of the early folks that was sort of told this is the way you should do it by a very enlightened trainer at a big brokerage firm. But most of my older colleagues that were supposed to be my mentors were like, that's a bunch of garbage.
Yeah,
right?
That'll never work. That's not a good business model.
Now nobody can remember that it was any different. And so, I think if you think of your business that way, it changes everything for me. Like, and look, I realize that there are some people who this is just totally like, what are you talking about?
This makes no sense.
Exciting, Pat. Like, no, what, dude, I just want to make a living, and that's fine. I actually don't believe that. I believe that all of us, because I've been there. I went to the first grade class, and every single one of them, their hands just went boom, right? Like, who creates stuff? Me. And I think all of us, I just think most of us have taken this titanium sort of time capsule, and we've opened it up, and we've put that thing in there, whatever that thing is, and we've screwed the lid on it, and we've jammed it down as far down because we got told, what are you going to do with that? That should be your hobby. That should be, do that on the side. And then we got busy and we said, forget it. And then we just said, that's for kids. And all I'm saying is let's take that capsule back out. Let's unscrew that lid and let's dance with that just a little bit. Like, maybe it is supposed to be a hobby. That's fine. Like, maybe the thing that you're feeling as we talk about this is, I've always wanted to write a novel. Cool, man, do it. Like, that doesn't mean leave your day job and become a novelist, or I've always wanted to paint, or I've always wanted to become whatever. Let's just open. All I want people to do is start opening this up just a little and just finding a way to dance. Now, if that expression happens to be your business, that's, beautiful, right? How lucky are you? And so, but either way, let's just dance a little bit with the idea of creating things, because I know we all want to. And even I can think of like stereotypical, I'm going to use CPAs for an example. I got a buddy who's a CPA that he drives a Toyota Corolla, and he will always drive a Toyota Corolla despite making like $300,000 a year. And he has like 4 ties, and he always wears a white shirt and one of those 4 ties every single day. His name's Kevin. He'd probably never hear this, and even if he did, there's plenty of Kevins in the world. And I'm always just like, really, like, but he loves that. Like, he gets way into it. But Kevin's got a capsule down there, and all I'm saying to Kevin is like, hey man, it'd be okay to open that up and just say, hey, is there something in here that I really love and I want to start dancing with a little bit?
Let me ask you the flip side here. I think there are a lot of folks that are listening to this that this is going to just so resonate with, but I wonder if there are a few listeners out there that are building successful businesses or are finding success in various ways that aren't experiencing this. And they may ask the question, am I supposed to be feeling this way?
Yeah.
Do you meet successful people that this is just not an issue? This is just not a conversation that they need to have? Or is it kind of ubiquitous?
No. I love that question. It's a super good question, because I think there's some danger here, and we're still dancing on the edge of where this danger is. Like, follow your passion and the money will follow is some of the most dangerous advice I've ever, received. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where that line is. I don't know what that is. Yes, because I know people who are just like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. But most of those people have something. Like, maybe it's not your business, right? Most of those people I know, like, I'm thinking of another one of my friends, his name's Jeff, and he wouldn't relate to this at all at business. Like, he's an operations guy, like a private equity guy that focuses on operations, and they just go in and make businesses more efficient. And he loves, I don't know that he would use the word love. He really, really likes that. I don't even know if he'd say that. I just think he says, hey, I'm good at this. But Jeff is a phenomenal photographer. And he's also really into sort of a mindfulness practice, mainly a sort of a Buddhist-based mindfulness practice. And you talk to him about that, and he'll cry. Mm. But at business, he's just like, and I can think of like there's a lot of entrepreneurs. There's a subset of entrepreneurs where the opportunity was simply just kind of discovered rather than created. So it was discovered, and you could think of like a dry cleaner, and people are like, man, this provides an amazing. My grandpa was this way. My grandpa was an intellectual property attorney, and he used to tell my dad all the time, if you could have a job that pays you really well and you like it even 50% of the time, but it allows you the flexibility to spend time with your family and serve in your church, you're better off than 99% of the world. And that's how he lived his life. He liked his work 55% of the time. And the rest of the time, he's like, it's work. It's okay. But man, I get to serve in my church and spend lots of time with my family. And that's what matters to me. So I don't think you should feel bad if you don't feel sort of the energy that I've been describing. I do think somebody like my grandpa probably bumped up against stuff where he's like, hey, I'd kind of like to, I don't know what his thing would have been. Like, I'd kind of like to get into carving wood sticks. And if you do that, I'm not talking about showing it to the whole world and selling it and getting paid money to go speak to people about it. I'm just saying it might be okay for you just to do that and show it to your friend. Like, hey, I created this thing. I hope you like it. That's all. But I think it's a really good question and it's interesting. And for people, if there's somebody listening who's just like, I'm not into that, I'm just into building a super efficient business and going home and doing sort of my, you know what though, even as I say that, I'm sure there are people that are into building super efficient businesses. But then when I say the going home part, look, there's no way that all of us don't have something.
Yeah.
Something where we're like, dude, I want to do that. Like, I want to be a better skier. Maybe it's just your kids. Like, I'm way into my kids. I want to be the best dad ever. Like, how can I be better about that? Maybe that's your capsule and you've been scared to open it because your dad wasn't awesome. And you're scared that you won't be able to do it either. And now you're like, you know what? I think I can do that. I'm just going to start taking some little steps and figure out how to. We've all got something. Maybe it's not our businesses.
I almost feel like we're defining the step before imposter syndrome here. And that is, it's just the fear that stops us. And what that fear is, most of this show, we've been talking about the imposter syndrome of feeling like, that you're a fake or you're a fraud or you don't know what you're doing. But maybe there's another step here that we're also talking about, and maybe not, but just saying that it's almost just this fear of failure, or this fear of the unknown, and it's just fear that stops us. And I would encourage listeners that are thinking this doesn't really apply to me, that I think as you define it and as you start to recognize it, you'll start to see it more in your life. You'll recognize it when that feeling pops up, and it may be a feeling that you couldn't identify before that pops up and you go, oh, I know what that is this time. And you'll start to see it. And I think I don't know if this is the best metaphor, but I remember when I started the podcast, I was like, what am I going to talk about? Like, what are we going to interview guests on? And over time, it becomes easier and easier to recognize the content and to hear something go, oh, we could do a show about that. Whereas that was really hard at first. So it's almost like once you start to pay attention to it, it'll become more real. And now hopefully have some tools in the tool belt to start addressing it.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think sometimes we've just been a little confused and maybe like even culturally conditioned. And I want to be clear about this. Like, look, it's not like this is anybody's fault. Like, it's not
right.
We shouldn't feel bad about this. It's not, there was no grand conspiracy theory. And I also want to make sure people understand that, like, even though I'm like all cool saying do it anyway, I mean, it's still paralyzing. Like, I hope that part goes away, but it's not going to. Like, just 2 weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a creative conference about art. And believe me, like, it was I was on a ballet stage, right? Like, believe me, I almost paralyzed, but I decided like, oh, hey, wow, I'm glad you're back, but you're really back. Like, that's pretty intense. So I actually recorded a 3-minute backstage in the green room while I was like, boom, I pulled up my voice recorder and recorded a podcast episode, just a 3-minute little episode on what I was feeling while I was sitting back there. But what I wanted to say was, I think we've been culturally conditioned to think of that feeling as a stop sign. And there was a time, whether you call it, I think the fear you described is an element of imposter syndrome, right? Fear of failure is an element of imposter syndrome. And I don't know whether imposter syndrome is the parent and
right.
Fear is the sibling or the child or vice versa. I don't really care. But I think, there was a time when that fear was a stop sign and it kept us alive. But here we're not talking about those things. We're just writing an email, right? Like Elizabeth Gilbert says. So we've just got to we've got to sort of condition ourselves to not see it as a stop sign. And that's the first step. So like you said, somebody's hearing this and thinking, I don't know, this doesn't apply to me. The next time you're going to bump into something, you're just going to bump into something. And the next time you bump into it, maybe now you'll have tools to go, oh, hey, maybe that's not a stop sign right there. Maybe that's a do it anyway sign. Maybe that's a green light. Maybe that thing I've been saying my whole life I want to do, but the stop sign keeps showing up. Maybe that was like good back in the day when it was a saber-toothed tiger around the corner. But this isn't a matter of survival. This is just a matter of doing something that I kind of want to just do. So if we can get one or two people, like, okay, we're going to get the people that are going to cry and say, oh, you nailed it. I feel that way every time I do this. That's awesome. And then it would also be really cool to get one or two people that it just they don't even feel it, but they start to recognize, oh, that's why. It's because I've been interpreting that feeling as a stop sign, stop at all costs. And now I'm going to understand it as, hey, I could do this anyway.
When we're talking about this, I mean, obviously our focus here has been, advisors and kind of obviously our listenership, and maybe it's starting a business or it's trying something new inside your existing business or whatnot. But I think this is so applicable to working with clients, because I would say every client that I ever worked with had they were expressing these emotions, but I couldn't identify what they were expressing. I'm not sure they could identify it either, but what's stopping them in their life. And maybe, and I'm thrilled to hear you're writing a book about it. For listeners, I had actually no idea that you were working on a book on this topic whenever we decided that this was the topic that we wanted to do. But, in order to kind of equip advisors to have this conversation with themselves, but also with clients, because what better work could we do if we can help a client or two just do whatever it is that's driving them, whatever it is that they want to do with their life.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Like, I think, it shows up all the time. Like, and I can think of a very specific area, right? This area where we say, what are your goals, right? Like, what do you want to do with your money? And we all know what that means is what do you want to do with your lives? But, we get the standard goals. I think it's kind of fun to ask after the standard, I want to retire, blah, 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 blah. And I don't mean that way. I just mean like they're sort of standard boring goals. Yeah. They're really important. But it's kind of fun to ask at the end, like, hey, is there anything just like kind of crazy? Is there anything you've always really wanted to do, but you might not even be willing to admit it? Like, oh yeah, I've always wanted to go to India and spend a 3-week time with doing yoga, or I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it'd be interesting to know that about somebody. Imagine if you could be the facilitator of that. And this is what I think real financial planning is. Like, I think first it's allowing somebody to get rid of the anxiety they feel. That's like the first step. But then the graduate level step is, how can I help people live their best lives? And I'm not going to say that in my marketing material, and I'm never going to even say it to clients, but it's just a little game we're going to play, right? It's a performance art piece. Like, if I could have 100 people that I have managed to find out some of their secret goals and dreams, and I secretly am going about trying to make that happen, and if I'm successful, they won't even really recognize I had anything to do with it. Right? I mean, they will, but we're not going to ask for credit. And then you can just sit back and look and go, like, imagine this. I think we probably talked about it last time. Like, if you go to a photographer's website and you click on the button that says work or portfolio, and up comes all these pictures they've taken. As a financial planner, if you had a button that said work or portfolio and we clicked on it, what would it be? It would be people's lives. And if you start to think that way, right? Like, I helped John and Jill Smith do these things. Like, I can think of Dave and Diane. I helped Dave and this is a real one. I helped Dave and Diane take a 6-month. They took their kids out of school, homeschooled their kids for 6 months on an RV while they traveled around the country. It was like one of their biggest goals in life. And I helped that. Like, I was part of that. That's amazing. I'll always remember that. They sent me pictures every week. In the end, they put together a little book saying, thank you. Here's what you did for our family. That's amazing work, right? And all that would take would just be one little, like, hey, digging a little deeper on those goals. And then you may even be able to say to them, why don't you do that? Oh, it's just not what people do. People don't go to India for 3 weeks. Or like, really? Why? What do you mean people don't do that? Like, there are people who've done it. Like, well, what do you mean people don't? Well, not in my family. Oh, why? Like, that's a fascinating conversation that nobody expected you to have, and you're certainly not going to put it on your like website. But then people, imagine somebody walking out of your office having that conversation with you, like, whoa, and they're walking to the car going, and then they get a cold call from the guy at wherever. Hey, I got a 2% CD I want to sell you. Like, and they're just like, dude, you don't even have any, like, it's not even in the same, like, that's a remarkable experience. That suddenly becomes a thing worth remarking about to their friends. You want to talk about building a business, like, you become the builder of dreams without ever telling anybody you're doing that, right? Anyway, pretty cool.
I love that. I wish I had that metaphor last night, because I did a webinar for a group of college kids that are in a financial planning major. And I just want them to know how amazing our career is. I mean, just how the work that we do and helping clients live great lives and live their best life. And not very many professions get to say that. Not very many professions, you can click the work tab and people's lives pop up. So if you're not excited about financial planning, if that doesn't excite you, I don't know what does. I mean, it's what gets me fired up to be in this profession. But Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show again. This was an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to getting you on again one of these days in the future.
Yeah, and Alan, real quickly, thank you for the generous work that you're doing for the world. Like, it's amazing to hear it, see it, and please just keep doing it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I bet you can see now why this was my favorite interview so far. No disrespect to any of our other 39 interviews, but it was just so amazing to go through this process and to actually have a name for the feeling or the fear of I'm not good enough or this will never work. I want to be sure that there's not any listener out there that lets this feeling stop you from chasing your dreams. Now, remember to join our VIP community where you can ask our members, guests, Kitsis and I, as well as interact with other members of the VIP community to get their perspectives at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.